Hello, Neighborhood Church. So we're going to be talking about Paul's letter to the Romans. So if you're watching this, you are probably in the Gather building on Friday, February 6th, while we are going through this introduction. Or you may be at home on your own the week later, or with your life group a week later and going through this material. So we're going to get started first by talking about a brief introduction to this letter and a little bit about the context and what was going on. So all this stuff is going to be in the Bible app. And if you're here at the Gather building, I should, if the tech has worked for me right, have this up on the overhead, either the TV or the projector for you to see as we're going through it so you know what's going on. So first, Paul's letter to the Romans for this first week. The reading is Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. You can use any translation you like. I like using the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is a little harder to find now online because there's an updated edition, which is fine also, but whatever translation is most comfortable for you or that you have, that's definitely the one to use. So when you start off your life group or your study of this, if you're at home on your own, I recommend you start by reading the reading for that day if you haven't already done it in preparation leading up to it. So right now for the life groups is when we're going to take time, kind of pause here and go through and do that reading. So now that we've read this, we're going to talk a little bit about the name Paul. In some places, you'll see his name as Saul with an S. They are the same person, but why sometimes Saul and why sometimes Paul? So Saul is the oldest name we read, the original one we read about Paul, especially in the book of Acts, and that comes from his Hebrew name. But the second name, Paul, is just the Greek version of his Hebrew name. Two very different languages that have very different styles and how words sound and what is traditional. So we see the same thing now between sometimes Spanish names and English names or from different languages. We see it today also, but we see it here a lot in this transition when Paul is dealing with the Hebrew people and being spoken about by the Hebrew people, and with them, Saul is often used, where as he transitions more to the Gentiles, we start to see more of a transition to the name Paul. And so Acts 13:9 addresses him as Saul, but adds that he is also called Paul. So it's just a matter of which language is being reflected. So who was Paul or Saul? So Paul was a Judean, a Jew, and he was born in a place called Tarsus, which is in modern-day Turkey, and probably around 5 to 10 A.D. So he was a Pharisee, so he was probably educated, at least in the Hebrew law, the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Old Testament. More on that later. He was also a Greco-Roman, meaning we call Hellenistic sometimes, a Hellenistic Jew, meaning that he was educated in, or at least familiar with, Greek culture and language. And he wrote in Koine Greek. Koine in Greek just means common. So he wrote in what was called common Greek at the time. And it can also be noted, and you will see through the study a little bit, where he actually used a certain style of writing known as Greek rhetoric. So he would have also spoken Aramaic. The Hebrew people at this time, their everyday language was Aramaic. That's the language that Jesus would have spoken. And probably familiar with Hebrew as a Pharisee, because a lot of the liturgical language from them was still Hebrew, so a lot of the scriptures in Hebrew. And so he probably would have spoken Aramaic every day, been familiar with Hebrew, and Greek, because if you were in trade or society, you had to know Greek, just like many places also have to learn English today. And it's believed pretty reliably that the copy of his Bible that he was using, which would have been just the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, would have been one in a Greek language, a Greek translation of that Bible, which is often called the Septuagint, which just means it's a form of a word meaning 70. And sometimes you'll see it rendered as LXX, the Latin or the Roman numeral for 70. And the reason 70 is because the story was, which it's a great story. I don't know, this is not likely true, that 70 scholars took 70 days to translate all the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and that they were all identical. Well, we obviously, that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but it got that name, the Septuagint, the 70. And so Paul was also a tent maker, and he oftentimes worked as a tent maker to support his ministry. And it's possible he was doing this to avoid the entanglements of a patron-client relationship that we read about in A Week in the Life of Rome. And so he was able to support himself as a tent maker in many of the places he went. So we know that Paul was educated. He was at least bilingual, if not trilingual, bicultural, steeped in Hebrew tradition and cultures and the Greco-Roman culture and traditions, and he's believed to be a Roman citizen. So Paul was a persecutor of Christians at first until around the early 30s AD, when the risen Christ appeared to him, and he became an apostle of Christ. And we can read about this in Acts 9, chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, or Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 to 17. I've included that in the Bible app, so you can go through and read those if you like. And so now we talk a little bit about apostle or disciple. So Paul was an apostle. Peter was a disciple. What's the difference? So an apostle means one who is sent. A disciple means a learner, a student, apprentice, one who follows after somebody else. So once Jesus' time with his disciples was complete, he sent them out as apostles. They were both disciples and apostles. Now, Paul, or Saul, was an apostle. He was sent by Christ, but he not a disciple in its original sense, because he didn't walk with Jesus, physically present with him, learning from him. But this title of disciple, the modern sense of it, has changed. Because obviously that was 2,000 years ago. There would be no disciples left. But we as Christians who are following after the teachings of Christ, who are reading the words of Christ in the Scripture and call ourselves Christians because we follow the teachings and the commandments of Christ, are then also, in that sense, disciples of Christ. Many of us also apostles. We'll get more into that in the future, maybe even in a coming sermon series about what it means to be an apostle, to be sent. And so for us, both disciples and apostles. So let's talk about Paul's writing. So Paul has been credited with writing 13 letters of the New Testament, and he definitely wrote 7. The other 6 are kind of disputed. There's some differences in style. Some of the dating of it they think is probably after his death. And so they think they were written pseudographically. Pseudographically is a fancy word meaning by somebody else in someone else's name, which is not plagiarism, and it's not a fake. It wouldn't have been seen that way at this time. A good example of that I heard, and I don't remember which. There was a preacher that I heard this online. I was talking about Walt Disney. If you watch a Walt Disney movie, you see the signature come up and the name Disney. None of us believe that a modern Disney movie, that old Walt had anything to do with it. He's been dead for quite a while now. But it was something that was done in his name, continued on in his legacy and what he started. And so a lot of people wrote things and attributed them to Paul, partly as attributing it to his teaching. And some of them may have been where Paul taught somebody else. Like if, say, Pastor Joe's teaching me about something, and then later on, I attribute it to Joe. I'm the one writing it, but I might say, the such and such, liturgy of a modern church according to Joe Lyles. Well, I'm writing it, but I'm writing based on what I learned from Joe. So that's what we're talking about pseudographically. So it was not intended with any kind of fraud or deception. It's not the way it would have been taken at the time. So the letter to the Romans. So the Romans was written by Paul from a place called Corinth around 56 to 57 AD. It's believed to have been delivered to Rome by a woman named Phoebe. And she may have even been the one to read this letter out to some of the congregations, some of the Christians in Rome. So, and this usage of Phoebe and her role in this, and a lot of other places in Romans we'll see, is part of a wider evidence of female leadership in the early church. Romans is also the only letter written to a congregation that Paul did not start himself. It It presents Paul's understanding of the gospel. It's looking to support a missionary journey to Spain. It addresses calming tensions that they're experiencing between Jews and Gentile Christians in Rome. These are churches and houses, so it's not like we're coming together to the neighborhood church from all of our different homes. It's more like what you're experiencing in life groups is what churches were at this time. So he's also looking for some support and contributions to take with him to Jerusalem and to give Romans some instructions on how to live as Christians, especially in their complicated world that we should be pretty familiar with after reading a week in the life of Rome. So about Christianity in Rome. Probably started around 30 to 40 AD, but not by Paul. There's no evidence that Roman churches were established by Peter either. No evidence that Peter ever even went to Rome. That's considered a sacred tradition in Roman Catholicism, but we have no record from Scripture and no clear evidence, direct evidence from local sources or sources from that same time about Peter ever visiting Rome. We know Paul did. We can read about that in the book of Acts. But remember, Paul was a Roman citizen, so when he was arrested, he had the right to stand trial, to give his own testimony. So that's why Paul was taken to Rome. Peter was not a Roman citizen. There was no reason for Rome to spend the money or the time to have him transported that distance across an ocean to Rome to stand trial. So Christianity in Rome is made up of disconnected house churches, made up of both slaves and free, male, female, and often with female leadership. There's the society and culture there at the time. There's a lot of social distrust of Christians because they didn't worship the same pagan gods, which was seen as a little unpatriotic and untrustworthy. And many social norms and expectations for the Roman people directly conflicted with Christian teaching, which, again, we became familiar with in that book, A Week in the Life of Rome. So there's a couple of theories of Paul's reason for writing. It could be one of these, it could be multiple of these, it could be all of them. And you kind of, as you get done with reading the entire book towards the end of the study, maybe look back and think about it and decide maybe what you think it might be. So one of them is to prepare a trip to Spain, which he mentioned, to resolve misunderstandings because there was a lot of conflicting teaching, to heal divisions in the church, to rehearse for a Jerusalem trip, to rehearse his material and the message he's going to put out. Or to create a timeless treatise or a circular letter, putting out maybe one of the first works of what you might call a systematic theology or dogmatics, or some combination of these, or maybe even all of them. So his thesis statement in Romans chapter 1, and this is going to be verses 16 and 17. The power to save, and this is not verbatim, this is just paraphrase. The power to save comes from hearing the gospel. And this power to save is for everyone. It's revealed through faith of Christ, for faith of the Christian. The one who is righteous by faith will live. Now, notice this word order is a little different than how you might read in the NRSV or another translation, which is often the one who is righteous will live by faith. So in Koine Greek, word order isn't as important as it is in English. The word forms themselves, how the endings of the words are formed, determine what word order does in English. Who is doing the action, who it's being done to, where it fits in the sentence. It is in how the word is formed, regardless of where it is in the sentence. So Romans 1:17, the word form's kind of ambiguous. It could mean the one who is righteous will live by faith, or the one who is righteous by faith will live. And the meaning can be a little different. We can have some conversation about that. But based on the totality of Paul's teaching throughout his letter and other letters, my belief is that the first one is the best one for clarity, that the one who is righteous by faith will live. And Paul, in this verse, he's quoting Habakkuk 2:4, or Habakkuk 2:4, depending on how you pronounce it. So looking at Habakkuk 2:4 in the Septuagint, which is the version of this scripture that Paul would have been using, it reads that The righteous will live by my faith. It's like pisteus mu, meaning my faith. And this is the voice of God speaking. So the righteous will live by my, as in God's faith, which is a third option altogether. So this is indeed where our righteousness comes from God, but we'll get more into that later. That is a spoiler alert. That will be a point of major conversation later on. So one more topic I'll leave you with before we open this up for reading the devotion and getting into the discussion questions. And this is kind of for the word nerds out there. If you'll notice in Romans 1, verse 14, Paul says that he is a debtor both to Greeks and barbarians, according to NRSV. And the Greek word is barbaros, which is where we get the word barbarian. And you think of it when in your mind in the image of what a barbarian is. He is not talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger and Conan the Barbarian, but just someone who does not adopt Greek language and culture. So I guess in a way that makes every one of us barbarians. So now we'll pick somebody to read the devotion, or maybe we'll split this up and each person, different people read different paragraphs, and then per table we'll go through and talk about these discussion questions and see what other people have to say. So I hope that you're able to follow along with these readings, and if you have any questions, something that you noticed in this reading that I did not address, shoot me an email or a text, and I'll do my best to dig into it and see if I can answer any questions you have. All right. We'll break up into our groups and have our discussion. Peace.